Hello and welcome to Expertise into Practice. This is Whole Education Send School Improvement Programmes Online CPD. I'm Bart Shaw. I'm the operational lead for the work we do with local authorities as part of the Send School Improvement Programme. I've been a researcher and author on Send for a national policy think tank. I've worked in DfE on policy, and I've been a secondary school teacher. And today, really excited to be bringing the first in this series of online CPD content to you. All the hundreds of Senkos that are part of our network and are involved in the program. And really what we tried to do with this series is design something that's going to be really accessible, that you can dip in and out of, that is going to really help you with your with developing and implementing your action plans. We're going to cover about 7 topics over the course of the year, loosely structured around the 7 themes. We're going to be looking at things like effective use of TAs and developing really inclusive curricula, really accurate assessment of need, and other topics as well. Today, we're going to be starting with a topic that many of you have told us is a really high priority in your schools, and that is harnessing teaching and learning for pupils with SEND. And the way it'll work, as will the other topics in this series, is that we're recording a short bit of content for you to engage with online as part on our Mighty Networks platform. We're then going to be following that with a live event. The live event for this topic is going to be on the 29th of November at 3:40. And we're delighted to be joined now and also then at the live event by Gary Aubin. So delighted today to be starting our series with Gary Aubin, who is a colleague of ours here at Whole Education. Gary leads the Matt Sen school improvement work, but he's also the author of the Lone Senko. He's been a primary and secondary Senko himself, Sen consultant. He's the EEF's resident Send expert, and I'm really pleased that he's here to be talking about teaching and learning with us today. So, Gary, can we start really broadly, please, and just ask you kind of what do you see as being the main challenges associated with teaching and learning for pupils with SEND?
Thanks, Bart. It's really nice to be here with a colleague such as yourself, recording this first in a podcast series. So thank you very much for having me, Bart. And thank you, Senkos and others who are joining the school. I don't underestimate the challenges for Senkos, for teachers, for getting it right in classrooms, whether you're a teacher or a TA, for our pupils with SEND. So we know that there are more pupils now being declared on school censuses. So there are more pupils than there were with SEND in our classrooms. We know that through the amount of the percentage of pupils with the HCPs, that there are more pupils with more complex needs in our classrooms than there were a number of years ago. And of course, that presents challenges in itself. They're the right challenges. They're signs of schools wanting to be inclusive, mainstream schools wanting to be inclusive and meet needs and not go, these needs have to be met in special. But actually, they, of course, can also create a challenge there for teachers. And let's be honest, many teachers don't feel expert themselves in relation to SEND. So actually, it's hard for them. They feel perhaps out of their depth in making good decisions for pupils with SEND. So as a result, what do? Sometimes we outsource to the Senko, and teachers look very quickly to the Senko to give them, the ideas and the inspiration and the advice, rather than thinking, actually, okay, I'm a teacher. I have expertise. I certainly have subject knowledge, and I know my class. I know this child. Let me think about making good decisions for them. But that's a challenge. And sometimes it's a challenge because we get stuck in a sort of death by strategies approach, where perhaps as a Senko or another leader in a school, we find ourselves going, here's 10 strategies for this need and 10 strategies for that need. And we start asking teachers to do things that actually are impossible in practice. So we're asking for too much to happen all at once, or sometimes to sort of deliver different curricula or take wildly different teaching approaches for pupils who have different needs. And actually it becomes impossible for teachers, let's be honest, to teach a cohesive and coherent lesson in that context. So I think we're a bit stuck in the idea that I think it's true that pupils have presented with more complex needs than they did a few years ago. And actually, I think that's as true in special as it is in mainstream. But I think sometimes we get a bit tied ourselves up in knots and potentially in a bit of a medical model where, because the pupils are more complex, we think that the things we have to do in classrooms are highly complex. And the best lessons that I've seen, the best colleagues I know in relation to their practice with pupils with SEND, even when pupils have complex needs, it's often fairly simple, not easy to implement always, but it's fairly simple approaches embedded really well, really consistently, without that adult taking it personally. So that every day starts afresh, even if it doesn't go well, as sometimes it won't. But I think, the best practice I see isn't teachers doing incredibly complicated things. It's often doing fairly straightforward things with a secure relationship with that child and doing them consistently and well, and reflecting on them.
And yeah, and building on that, sort of, could you give us some examples of approaches or kind of baskets of approaches that teachers might be prioritizing when they're thinking about high quality teaching for pupils with
Yeah.
SEND?
Yeah, and it's tricky because I mean every child is different, aren't they? And we no two children are the same. That's certainly true, and no two children with SEND are the same. So when we talk about high quality teaching, are we talking about different teaching approaches for each of those children with SEND and/or every single child in our classroom? And of course, we can't, of course, because we can't teach 30 different ways to 30 different children. We have to find one inclusive approach that works across our classroom, knowing that that's not all we'll ever have to do. We still need to have some bespoke approaches. We still need to do some individual adaptations for individual children. But if we're trying to do 6 individual adaptations for every single child with SEND in our class, and perhaps some others as well, that's when I think we get a bit lost. So we need a framework, I think, of what high quality inclusive teaching is. And if you are a Senko listening in, because you're a Senko on our SEND program at Whole Education, then actually it's about thinking how clear am I about the message I give on what high quality teaching is. Because if I'm honest, when I was a Senko, I am certainly guilty of going high quality. High quality teaching is what it is. Every teacher's a teacher of SEND, off you go, and not really supporting teachers with what I meant by that. So I work, as you said there, Bart, in the introduction with the EEF, and they've their SCN in mainstream guidance report, which please look it up if you don't know it already. It talks about these 5 recommendations, the middle of which, the third one, is access to high quality teaching. And that from their sweep of the evidence, they found 5 approaches that kept coming up in high quality, relevant studies that in which pupils with SEND made better progress as a result. And I'll go through this in much more detail when we have our live event together. But just to sort of flag up those quickly, those 5 approaches that work for pupils with SEND according to a vast evidence base: explicit instruction, cognitive and metacognitive strategies, scaffolding, flexible grouping, and using technology. So the beautiful thing about those, as I find, Bart, and when I talk to many school leaders and Senkos and teachers and teaching assistants about these approaches, is that people receive them going, okay, I don't need to go and get a master's in SEND necessarily, even though there are more children with SEND in my class and perhaps also their needs are more complex. It's not necessarily that I should undervalue my own skill as a teacher or teaching assistant. Actually, the answers, according to the best available evidence from the EEF, says that they're things that I might already be doing in pockets and I could add more consistently, or I might already be doing for some pupils and I could look at what that looks like for all pupils. And if I'm not doing them, perhaps the person in the classroom next door to me is. Essentially, they're skills that exist and expertise that already exists within schools by and large. So if we think about explicit instruction, and now's not the time clearly for me to go into lots and lots of detail, but people might already know Rosenshine's 10-step model, great evidence base for all pupils, and also that explicit instruction approach has that evidence base for pupils with SEND. So why might that work for pupils with SEND? Well, it really focuses on clear communication, on checking understanding frequently, on treating learning as a process that moves towards independent practice, but isn't a sort of university style, I talk, you write it down and off you go, now it's learned, but actually is like I do, we do, you do, and thinks carefully about what that we do phase looks like that can really support pupils in their learning. So I think with all these elements that start with teaching and learning, not starting with I need to teach you 100 things about receptive language needs. We need to talk about visuospatial sketch pads, and we need things that actually many teachers don't feel they have the expertise to bring those things into their classroom well. But what they do have is the ability to teach well and to develop their own teaching practice with some support and coaching and guidance and feedback along the way. But what people don't have the capacity to is to become total SEND experts in one twilight every term, for example. So actually the answer from the EEF lies in high quality teaching primarily. And I think the really helpful thing they've done is articulate those 5 approaches, this 5-a-day approach, as they call it, that really supports teachers and empowers teachers and leaders in schools to go, okay, this is a language I speak. This is a framework I can understand.
Absolutely. And really important to be recognizing that point about kind of capacity and, levels of, the levels of expertise that we expect of our teachers. And it made me think about the capacity of Senkos actually. And, it's clearly maybe a bit much to expect Senkos to be offering that kind of one-to-one support with every teacher in a school to make sure that they are they are utilizing their skills in the best possible way for their children with SEND in their classes. So how might Senkos sort of be a bit more strategic about developing teacher practices in this way?
Yeah, it's really tricky, isn't it? Because we can know it, and Senkos often speak to the blue in the face about what high quality teaching is, or about sort of the need for high quality teaching to be in place across all classrooms, but actually making it happen in practice is, like all things in schools, the greatest challenge, isn't it? And I think there are many things that we know won't work. We can send out 100 strategies over email to teachers and say, get on with it, and we know that that won't work. We can lead a big sort of CPD session after school in September, and then we never come back to these things, and I think we know that that won't work. So all the Senko, like you say, can try and do it all on their own, and there'll always be limited results and impact when Senko tries to do everything on their own. So I think the first thing for me is about a bit of self-reflection for Senkos to go, actually, how clear is the message here? Because if the message is lots and lots of different things for lots and lots of different people, and that's all I'm offering, then I think that's tricky. If it's what we're saying we want in every classroom, and then when you explain it, actually takes 10 minutes to explain, or it's really not pitched correctly for where your staff body are or their own expertise within SEND, then that's a problem. So I think it starts with clarity of message from Senkos. If they want change in classrooms, we need to think, actually, am I able to articulate this clearly? Because if I can, then others can learn too. And if they can articulate it clearly, then they can think about it with clarity, and that can lead to them, implementing these things in classrooms. So it starts with a bit of self-reflection around clarity of message. But then, of course, it becomes, all right, what's your context there? So people on the call trying desperately to get teacher practices to change will be thinking about their own school context and where current levels of training and support have been historically, whether there is the right mindset of inclusion across the school, or whether really that's the first thing to tackle, whether a sort of program that is universal across the school is going to work, or whether there's such a difference in what they do in early years compared to year 6, or in year 6 compared to year 13, that actually it takes different approaches for different pockets of the school, which isn't possible everywhere, but needs to be considered. And then I think it's about aligning with core messages. So what I see sometimes in schools is the teaching and learning lead, or in a primary, perhaps that's the head teacher talking about what they want to see from every teacher in every classroom. If that teaching, learning lead or principal or head of school, whatever, stands up on day one and says, please, we're all going to do this year. This is how I'd like to teach. And then the Senko stands up on day 2 and says, for pupils with SEND, this is how I'd like to teach. Then inevitably whose message gets heard the loudest is the person talking teaching and learning, because often they're more senior than the Senko, which can be problematic, but is often the case. And number 2, because they're talking a language that people feel fairly confident and comfortable and see as the core of their job, i.e. teaching. So that one wins, and then the messages of the Senko lose out often. So it needs to be aligned, was sort of my point there, is that those messages that the Senko is saying about what's expected and hoped for in classrooms need to align with wider messages. And if they don't align with wider messages, either don't waste your time or get those wider messages changed, work out what the problem is there, but don't just sort of bang a drum for SEND on your own. And final point is linked to that then is about things being done alongside leaders. So if you have a head of English or a head of literacy in your school, they don't just have a job to lead English provision or lead literacy provision for 85% of pupils, and then Senko, you have the rest, please. their job is to do their job well and to undertake their responsibility for English or for literacy, for example, for 100% of pupils. That's really tricky for some pupils, including some pupils with SEND, and that's why the SENCO is there to support them to do that. But it's not to do it for them. So actually, it's about working alongside those other leaders and working out, okay, let's got an explicit instruction as our thing for the whole school, for example, or effective scaffolding as a thing for the whole school. Let's take some time to make sure the English lead or literacy lead or whoever thinks about what that means for them in their area, is supported with how they can drive it, how they can hold teachers in their department to account. But vitally, it's not the SENCO doing all of that work. So in terms of, if your question there is about, making these changes in reality, it's about working with others, aligning messages, a clear message that it starts with a clear message. And then, of course, it's about not beginning and ending on September the 1st, for example, but actually making sure that we are with other leaders banging that same drum, hopefully in different ways to keep that message feeling a bit fresh, but that actually it keeps momentum over time and doesn't just begin and end in one session.
Really interesting, Gary, and it's making me think that when you're doing your self-evaluations, you're writing your action plans, it's not losing sight of the links between things that are in the intent, which the sort of vision and leadership side of things that are in that intent section really do translate into I guess this is more implementation, isn't it? And so it's kind of it's making sure that we're really clear that the kind of things start with that real clarity of intent and clarity of purpose across leadership in the schools.
Absolutely. And as Natalie and David both talk about in their session, starting with the why before we get to the how and the what, and make sure everything everything is linked to a wider strategic purpose. And I think that the self-evaluation is a really nice vehicle for helping SENCOs find the why and to think about those bigger picture bits of change in their school.
Great. Thank you so much, Gary. Really looking forward to talking to you more on the 29th. But for now, thank you and goodbye, everyone.